Hi guys, this is John Anderson with Ragdoll Animation Studios. You can find us at www.ragdollanimation.com. Today we'll be discussing how to create multiple successive impact craters, possibly to be used as a time lapse or if you are simulating impacts from a meteor shower or that kind of thing. I developed this process several years ago while creating an e-learning animation demonstrating lunar crater formation. To create our impact craters, we'll be using 3ds Max, Zbrush, and After Effects. You don't necessarily have to use Zbrush in your own workflow if you prefer not to, or if you're unfamiliar with it. You could use graphite modeling freeform tools, you could use Mudbox, you could create an alpha in After Effects, whatever works for you. Ultimately, what we need to do is we need to achieve an animated alpha that we can then apply to a particle system, and then we'll apply that as a displacement in our final simulation. As usual, there are multiple ways to achieve the same result. I personally like ZBrush, that's what I'm familiar with, so that's what I'll be using. To start, I always begin with reference. So right here, I've gone through dozens and dozens of photos, and right here I found one that's a relatively fresh impact crater, um, or appears that way. So there are all kinds of different impact craters that you can look at, and there's different ages to them. So you may find one that's got a very flat surface. Typically, that's from a lava flow that's infilling the lunar crater. So keep that in mind. Kind of do some research and figure out exactly what it is that you're creating. Um, so with that said, we're going to get started in 3ds Max. All we're going to do to start is just drag out a plane. I'm going to turn on my snaps toggle. I'm going to right click, make sure I have grid points selected. Turn off vertices if you have that selected or if you have anything else selected. Close that. Again, make sure that this is blue. This toggle button up here is blue. And then I'm going to select plane. I'm just going to drag this out on the grid. You don't necessarily have to drag it out on the grid. It's just I kind of like to be organized, um, so it's something I like to do. Alright, so next thing is we're going to name this. We're going to call this crater base, crater alpha base. Okay, and we're going to give it quite a few segments, so I'm just going to give it, I want to have a lot, so I'm going to give it 500 by 500. I realize that this is really dense. Not to worry, we're just trying to make sure that we have enough geometry so that we can actually capture all the detail that we're looking for and not have to worry about having to add geometry later. In something like ZBrush, geometry is very important, so you want to start with the full amount of geometry that you're going to need, because ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to use this, we're going to create morph targets from it, a progressive morph showing the impact expansion. So alright, so I'm going to grab this, I'll convert this to an editable poly, and I will export this. I'm just going to put this in my my crater folder. So I have this folder right here, tutorials, moon craters, and then I'm going to export this as an OBJ, and I'll just call this crater base. Excellent. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is I will go ahead and jump into ZBrush. I'm going to import that crater base plane. Oh, where am I? Dropbox. I need Dropbox. There we go. And then Ragdoll Studios, tutorials, moon craters, and there's the crater base plane. Now I'm going to drag that crater base plane out into the canvas, but you notice that you're not seeing anything right there. That's because the normals are flipped opposite the direction that you're facing. So in order to be able to see that, you can click edit here, or you can hit T to turn on edit mode, and then you can go down into your display properties and turn on double-sided, and now you'll see that you can see that plane from both sides. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is zoom in on this plane, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I typically will start with a like a clay buildup brush. It's one of my favorite brushes, so that's what I'm going to start with. And in the center, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a depression where we're getting that initial impact crater. Before I do that though, I want to go in, I like to save morph targets, so I'm going to go ahead and store a morph target, and that will record this flat plane, and we can always go back to this if we need to. So there are a couple things to know about ZBrush. Up here we have our subtool palette, okay, and then we have our geometry palette. Those are probably your two most important palettes that you're going to need to know. So in our subtool palette, we have our crater base, and we're going to duplicate this as we are progressing through and making this impact crater expand. We'll be creating duplicates that we'll later export to use as morph targets in 3D Studio Max. The other thing you need to know is up here on the left hand side we have our brushes. If you click, you can select any one of these brushes. There are a couple that are kind of the go-to brushes. The clay buildup brush, the standard brush, the H-polish brush. I like all of those. We'll be using the move brush, possibly the pinch brush for this tutorial. And then the next thing you need to know is up here we have our Z intensity. So this is how intense the brush is, the size of our brush, and the focal radius. So the focal radius is basically, or the focal shift is basically, if we look at our cursor here, you can see there are two rings. The inner ring controls the brush 100%, so you have 100% strength in that inner ring, and then the outer ring you have 0% strength, and the distance between the two rings determines the fall off between those two between the full brush and the 0%. And then we also have our Z add and our Z subtract. So Z add, essentially all that does is adds. It's an additive brush. And then Z subtract is a subtractive brush. Okay? So you'll be toggling back and forth between those two brushes. Now the shortcut to toggle between Z sub and Z add is Alt. If you have Z add selected and you hold down Alt, then it will subtract. Okay? If you release Alt, you'll have an additive brush. So that's very important to know, especially for this, because we'll be using it quite a bit. Alright, so then what I'm going to do is I am actually going to shift my focal shift, and let's see. I think I was going to use the clay buildup brush, but I think I'm going to go ahead and use the standard brush, and I'm going to use one of these alphas. If I click here, I can select one of these alphas. I'm going to use one that's got quite a bit of fall off to it. Okay, and I'm going to start by just creating that initial impact crater. Alright, and then I'll give this impact crater just a little tiny bit of an outer ring. Like that. Okay. So as I had said, we're going to go ahead and store morph target. We're going to create duplicates as we're progressing through this sculpture. So I'll just come over to my subtool palette and I'll hit duplicate. And now this bottom layer will be this initial impact, and the layer that we're working on will continue to build that up. All right. So next thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and make this outer ring much more defined, and I'll actually increase my Z intensity and just really work this outer ring up quite a bit. And that's going to be where the impact force is forcing this material outward and up. So it doesn't have any place to go, so it's pushing it outward and up and creating this bulge. Okay, the next thing I'll do is I'll use my move brush and I'll just expand this a little bit. And you notice we can see the previous layer, the duplicated layer underneath. So I don't want to see that, so I'll just click solo, and now I don't see it anymore. We're only seeing our active layer. And probably I'll make this a little deeper as well. Oop, I'm still on my move brush. I need to switch back to my standard brush. And then I'll just deepen this. Now you'll notice that when I was drawing that out, nothing's really happening, and that's because I have the lazy mouse turned on. So if I go up into my stroke menu and then down to lazy mouse, I can turn my lazy mouse off, and then whatever I do will happen immediately. So I'll just turn down the Z intensity, and I will go ahead and try and deepen this crater. Now, if you want to smooth out your geometry, if you hold down Shift is our smoothing brush. You can see up here that when I toggle Shift, it brings up the smoothing brush. So you want to use that quite a bit. And then if you want to see the change in the your two targets, you can just come over here and toggle back and forth. Okay. So I like that. I think that looks pretty good. The next thing I'm going to do is create another duplicate, and then I'll just continue expanding and building up. Now I'm going to not use this alpha anymore, and I'm just going to use the normal standard brush with no alpha, and I'll start building this. Oop, that's subtracting. I start building this up even more. Increase my intensity. It's too much. Bring it down. And it's fine for this outer area to be irregular. I'm sure that the material at the impact site is going to be, it probably will not be a consistent density. So having a variety of, you know, shape and irregularity will probably be pretty realistic. So we're also going to start getting something called ejecta outside of the crater, which is the material that's been displaced is now going to fall back to the ground, and it's going to create kind of a ring of just that excess material. So we'll have that in our simulation as well. So I'm going to actually use something called an inflate brush to kind of inflate this outer ring. And really get kind of a defined ring. Okay, and then I will smooth this out just a little bit, and I think that looks good. I'm also going to go ahead and deepen that impact crater a little bit. I think right in the center, and I'll smooth it out. So again, cycling through these, you have your initial impact, an expansion, and then this expansion is still very much the same size. So we're going to use that move brush again to kind of expand it and move it outward a little bit. Alright, I'll create a duplicate, and then I will just continue, building this up. So I'm going to start, this is all going to happen over the course of a couple of frames, so you're not going to see a ton of detail per frame. It's going to happen very quickly. You're more or less just going to catch um, the motion, not the specific detail in each stored frame. So, but as I get towards the final frame, I'm just trying to add some detail because it should, that's where you'll really be able to see the detail is as the crater is settling. And we're getting that ejecta kind of falling back down. And then you're also going to have, if you remember looking at our reference, you're going to have some of those striations on the inner part of the ring from in the crater. So I'll work that up as well. I'm going to choose a different alpha. I'll probably choose one of these kind of striated alphas, and I'll just kind of see if I can't create some of that effect there too. You're going to see that because we've been using the move brush to expand this crater, that you have less ability to acquire detail in the inner part of the crater. That's fine. We don't need a super, a ton of detail there. We just want to kind of give that impression that there are striations there. And then I'm going to go ahead and flatten out the base a little bit using my H polish brush. Just kind of flatten that base out a little bit. Alright, and then I'll go back to my clay buildup brush, and I'm going to set this real low, and I'm just going to build up kind of the area around the crater where there's that ejected matter. Okay, and then I'll use my standard brush, and I'm just going to grab some of this spotting here, and then I'm going to use my spray right here. This is the stroke. It basically allows you to control how the stroke is being laid down. So I want it to spray a little bit, And what that's going to look like is something like that. But we're going to turn the Z intensity down quite a bit and just kind of just add a little bit there. Okay. Like so. Alright, that looks pretty good. Ultimately, I think it'd be good if you had, if you created multiples of these craters, different types, different looks to them, so that in our particle flow, when we add this in 3ds Max, we won't see the same crater repeated. For this tutorial, we're just going to go ahead and use the same crater, but ultimately, it wouldn't be bad if you had separate craters. So if we cycle through, you're going to see that these are the same size. I still want this to expand, so I'm going to use the move brush and I'm going to continue expanding it a little bit. And then I'm just going to mess with the regularity of this shape because I don't want it to be perfectly regular. Okay. And here, now if we cycle through this, we'll start at the first one, second one, third one, fourth one. Alright. I think that that looks pretty good. We could do a lot more work trying to make this look fantastic, but we don't really need to for this. This is really just to show how to do this. See if I can't just work this up a little bit more. Alright. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to export each of these, essentially these layers that I've created. These are all going to be morph targets, so I'll just export them one at a time. Starting with the first one, I'll click export. I'll come over here and I'm going to make a new folder for my morph targets. Okay, stick that in there. So I'll call this crater base 1. And I'll go to the next one. I'll export that as crater base 2. And then again the next one, export crater base 3. And then the final one, I'll export this as, oop, I didn't mean to do that, Control Z. Alright, export this one as crater base 4. Alright, and now I'm going to jump back into 3D Studio Max. And with this plane selected, I realize again that this has a lot of polys. It may be that your system won't handle this many polys. If that's the case, you'll just want to reduce the number of polys. We did 500 by 500. Maybe you want to try 250 by 250. The only down problem with that is in something like ZBrush, you're not going to get as much detail from a lower resolution object. So, all right, so I'm going to add a morpher modifier. So in your create panel, select the drop down and then find the morpher modifier. And then what we're going to do is we're going to import the morph targets that we just exported from ZBrush. So I'm going to go to the application icon and I will click import and I'll just navigate to that folder that we're using. Okay, and we have our morph targets, and you can only import these one at a time. So crater base 1, I'll have to rename this, so actually that's fine. I'll accept that name. I will move this over to the side and then import the next one, Crater Base 2. Okay, just move that over. The next one. Okay, move that to the side. And then the last one, Crater Base 4. Hit OK. And move that over to the side. So I'm going to grab all of these and I'm going to create a new layer for my morph targets. Okay, and then I'm going to just move this, my active layer back up to the default. Now with my morpher selected, I'm going to right click here where it says empty. I'm going to pick from scene. I'm going to pick that first morph target, okay? And then everything else we're doing after this is going to add to a progressive morph. So if we go up to where it says pick object from scene and you pick the next target, all right, you'll see that under progressive morph over here you have your two morph targets. So we'll continue to do that until we have all of our morph targets selected. I have 4 targets. You know, you could have 10, depending on how detailed you want that crater expansion to be. So now if I go ahead and hide that morph target layer, we can zoom in on our current layer, and then you can see that we're getting that crater expansion there. I'm just going to go ahead and create a animation so we can watch it expand and see how it looks without actually seeing all of the white edges there. Okay, again, this is going to happen over the course of like probably 8 frames, so it's gonna be quick. So if we were to see how that looks, I'll just click this and drag it back to frame 8, and then you'll see that this is going to happen very quickly. Right? So you're not really seeing the detail in the initial crater expansions morph targets. You're just seeing that final detail. So that's really where you need to make sure that the focus of your detail is in that final crater. Alright, so what I want to do now is I need to create a UVW map for this, and I'm not going to create this in the usual way. I don't want the UVWs to be laid out nicely. What I want to do is I want to create some height variation in the UVW. So here I want to see that I want to add a gradient. All right, so and I want to see some variation in that gradient. So I'm going to apply a UVW map. You'll see what I'm doing as I get this a little further along. So I will select my gizmo in my UVW map. I'll turn on my angle snaps toggle, and then I'm just going to rotate that UVW map gizmo 90 degrees. All right, and here you can see that this line at the top of your UVW map gizmo, this indicates the up direction in your UVWs. Okay, so if I were to add, well, it's not really going to matter here, but just so you know that. I could also come down here and click fit, and it will fit the entire UVW to the object, but I want to make sure that when I do that, I'm on the last frame. Alright, and you'll see if I go into my front view that expands through for the entire thing. Alright, I am going to just expand it a little further, like so. And the reason I want to do that is because I want the I don't want there to be overlap between each side. So I'll just scroll back, make sure that the entire thing stays inside that UVW. So that looks pretty good. Alright, the next thing I want to do is open my material editor. I'll click M for materials. I'll select my first material, which is, if you can see this right here, it came in from ZBrush with a material on it. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that. And then I will apply this first material to our crater plane. I'll name this Crater Alpha, or Crater Gradient will be more appropriate. And then I'll go down to my maps, I'll click diffuse color, none, and then I'm going to add a gradient ramp. Alright, and if you look at this in the viewport, you can see that the gradient is left to right. I want to rotate that 90 degrees. So now you can see that there's black at the top and white at the bottom. Again, that's inverted, so I could go to my output and invert that, but you're not going to see that in the viewport. So the other way that you can do it is just to come up here and change this first flag to white. Get rid of this middle flag by right clicking and hitting delete, and then change this right flag to black. Okay, and then we're getting some decent gradients there. So I'm going to 100% self-illuminate this, and I'm just going to render it out and see what it looks like. That looks pretty good. Now, I could just go ahead and leave this, and I probably will just leave this way. I think this looks pretty good. I'm not getting any areas that are too blown out. I'm not getting any areas that are too dark. So that should give us some nice variation in our displacement, or in our final displacement. I also like this outer area being gray. We actually do want that, because we want, if this was all black out here, then we wouldn't have this nice depression in the center of this crater. So having this outer area be kind of a 50% gray is good for what we're doing. What I will do though is, just in case I get some environment background in my render accidentally, like you see over here, I have some of the environment background. I'm going to go ahead, go up to render, choose environment, and I'm going to click on where it says color for the background, and then I'll select this dropper, and I'm going to click on my render just at the very outer edge to get that gray, and then click OK. And now when I render this, you'll see that there's no black in our render. It'll transition nicely from the plane to the background. Alright, and that's good. Alright, so I'm just going to kind of center this crater like so. I know we have kind of a good 8-frame animation there. I like that. I might zoom in a little further, so I could just zoom in a little more so I get a little more detail. I also want to go up into my renderer, render setup. I want to make sure I have this set to a power of 2, so we'll try 1024 by 1024. I want my range to be 0 to 10 frames. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a save for this. I'll put it in that tutorials folder. Alright, so I will call this alpha render, and this I'll call crater alpha. And I'm just going to save it as a JPEG because it's Doesn't cost us a lot in memory. And I'm going to go ahead and hit render. This should render fairly quickly. So over the course of about 26 seconds. And you should see this nice initial impact. We could sharpen this up a little bit so that we have a more defined initial impact, but again, you're not really going to see a lot of that over the course of 8 frames. It's just happening so quickly. Your eye sees something like, I don't know, it's 20 or 30 frames a second. So, alright, so that looks pretty good. Now what I want to do is just go ahead and save this in case we need to get back to it. So I'm going to put this in its own folder, and this will be the morpher. I'm going to hide that, and I'm going to set my active layer back to my default. Alright. So what I want to do now is create another plane. This is going to be a power of 2, so we'll just, well, not a power of 2, but it's going to have to be square, so we'll just do, I don't know, 100 by 100. And then we're going to set our length and width segments to 1 each. And then we're just going to hit M for the material editor, and we're going to apply a new material to this plane, and we're just going to select those renders that we just did. There is one problem to that. I have to open up After Effects, so I will go ahead and open my After Effects here.